Well, thank you for being here, everyone. I imagine we'll still have a few more people joining us in course, but this is our, what is this, the fifth week of Lent and the fifth Sunday that we're doing this program on Guides in the Wilderness, journeying with the saints through Lent. And tonight we have Steve Falci here and the tradition of praying with the Examen. So Steve will tell us all about all of those things over the course of this next hour. So Steve Falci is a member of the St. John's community. He's been coming to St. John's. Steve, you'll have to fill us in on the exact details, but for a couple of years, or maybe on and off for a little bit longer. Steve has an MA from Pittsburgh Seminary. He was formed by the teaching and ministry of Jesuits in a number of different settings, and he works in the field of sustainable investing, where he draws from this great Jesuit tradition that has shaped him and applies that into so many different aspects of his life and work. So with that, Steve, thank you for being here to present to us and to share your journey with the Jesuits with us, and invite us into some of those spiritual practices that have shaped and formed you. Unmute yourself, Steve.
See, I'm unmuted. Okay, that's the way a lot of my meetings at work start too, with people reminding me to do that. Okay, good evening. I'm so glad to be with you all tonight. What I'd like to do over the next hour is provide an overview, first of the life of Saint Ignatius, who was the founder of the Society of the Jesus, the order known as of Catholic priests known as the Jesuits, and spend a lot of time on the spirituality. Has been his gift to all of Christianity, Ignatian spirituality. It has a foundation in his spiritual exercises that for many years was the realm of Jesuit priests and Roman Catholics, but today has a wide spectrum of disciples, including Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Quakers, Mennonites, and other Protestant denominations that the Jesuits have welcomed and call our extended Ignatian family. Ignatius has been a journey on my companion on my journey, although I didn't always know it. My first encounter with the Jesuits was when I was a high school student at a high school called Fordham Prep in the Bronx, run by the Jesuits. And I see a lot of the Ignatian principles that had come out later in life that they were not as explicit about, but were clearly about informing us. Particularly, I'll talk about being men and women for others. Ignatius was definitely a guide to me as I was exploring while I was a money manager in Pittsburgh, and having done some campus ministry work, had a desire to go to seminary. And when I became a money manager in Pittsburgh, I was able to go to seminary as an evening student at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And then I kind of returned to the Jesuits when I moved to Washington, D.C. after graduating, and became a member of Holy Trinity Parish in Georgetown, where I was blessed to have the opportunity to do the spiritual exercises in daily life, was introduced to the Examen, and through that period gave me the ability to examine my whole life and to see where Ignatius and the Jesuits had been guiding me. Tonight, I'd like to take us through a quick overview of the life of Ignatius, talk a little bit about his spirituality and how it was woven into his life and how it came to be. You'll notice in this opening slide here, I have Ignatian saints in quotes. I initially was looking to do this as more of a academic presentation, but as it started to flow, I decided to bring in what more contemporary saints in the life that were Jesuits or had Ignatian backgrounds have influenced
Steve,
me.
you still need to share the slideshow with us.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I'm still on the first slide then.
Yeah.
Okay, Nathan, help me again. Where do I go?
Bottom of the screen, there's the share screen button.
I'm sorry. Okay. Let me click. Hold on a second.
Next to the chat icon.
You know what? I think let me hold on. Let me close this down. Shoot. My screen just went blank. Hold on.
Oh, I think Helen accidentally shared her screen with us. Hold on.
Okay.
Let me do it this way. Hold on, Steve. Okay, you should have next to the participants chat polling buttons at the bottom.
Okay, there. I got share screen.
Good.
How's that?
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So now, as you can see, I have Ignatian saints in quotes. And what I'm going to try to do is talk about some other saints other than Ignatius that were influenced by Ignatian spirituality that have touched my life. And then I'd like to close with a prayer called the Examen, which has been central to Ignatius is guiding us in daily life to understanding how God may be calling us to do different things with the talents we've been given. Okay. Now I'd just like to open us in prayer with a prayer called the Suscipe. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all I have and call my own. You have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Just a few words on the Suscipe. It comes from the Latin word to take. And it's the most famous, but arguably one of the most difficult prayers attributed to St. Ignatius. And I know some of my Ignatian companions on this call are going, what is he doing talking about this first? It's so hard. And in fact, James Martin, who I'll speak about a little later, who is a prolific Ignatian writer, has said that every day he looks at that and wonders how he can live up to it. But it very much can be viewed as a goal that embodies the spirituality of St. Ignatius. It's rooted in God's unconditional love for us, gratitude for all the gifts we have been given, and the ability to surrender to God and trust in God to guide us in the use of our gifts, to do God's will, to create a more just world. And through that, we receive the consolation that we are sustained in all we do by God's love and grace. Ignatian spirituality's aim is to create contemplatives in action, contemplatively praying to discern God's will or call, to use the gifts God has given us to act in the world. Being contemplative in action means that our active life feeds our contemplative life, and our contemplative life informs our active life. The first step in being a contemplative action is to stop, pause, and acknowledge what we've been doing, whether in our work or in our personal life. Then reflect on our daily experience and our major ones to help us to delve into their deeper meaning. This can be done through the Examen prayer, as I had mentioned, we're going to do a little bit later. This contemplation allows us to renew our active lives, whether it be at work, in our relationships, and see where God has been active in our life. Being a contemplative in action means that your life feeds your contemplative life, and your contemplative life forms what you do. And this cycle never ends. The corollary I've seen in being a member of St. John's is Nathan, Ann, and Rob's call for us to be the church. And I'm proposing that as a corollary to being contemplatives in action, where we're nurtured through prayer, communal worship, and fellowship, so we can go out in action to be the church. Now let us take a look at the life of St. Ignatius. He was born in 1491 in the Basque region of Spain to a family of minor nobility. His early years, he was a courtier and a nobleman focused on worldly success. And he says of himself in his autobiography, he was given to the vanity of the world and a great and foolish desire to win fame. By all reports, he was a bit of a hothead, and in fact had an incident where he chased down a man in anger with his sword and may have been arrested. He certainly did not have the temperament of a contemplative. He was trained in the art of warfare, and while he was in service to the Duke of Navarre in Pamplona, he took part in the Battle of Pamplona in 1521, where a French cannonball shattered his leg, which was a life-altering experience in many ways. For 6 months, he convalesced back in Loyola under the care of his brother and his brother's wife. He only had 2 books to read, one on the life of the saints and one on the life of Christ. As he read these 2 books, he noticed a change in himself. He had daydreams. Some of the daydreams involved being a knight and winning the love of a noble woman. At first, it's sounding very desirable, but eventually left him feeling inwardly dry and discontent as he related. But with the thought about a service to others and to God, like the sense, gave him a deep sense of joy that did not wane. This was the first sense that Ignatius has had that God could speak to us through our inner feelings. And this was the root of the discernment of spirits, which I'll talk about in a moment, providing what Ignatius has described as consolation, that a deep sense of both fire in our hearts to serve God and others, and a deep sense of enduring inner peace and joy, versus another emotion, which he referred to as desolation, a deep darkness or turmoil, where there are doubts and anxieties and feelings of separation from God. When he thought about his old life of nobility, he would often feel dispirited, a sense of desolation. But doing great things for God and Jesus, like the sense, gave him deep joy and satisfaction. And he said, and I'm quoting very basically, I can do this. So at 30, he decided to devote his life to the service of God. And I may be taking a little license with this, but I would say this is probably the root of the motto of the Jesuits about all we're doing for the greater glory of God, going by the initials AMDG, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam. He then entered in a period of spiritual wandering, as I would call it, that after recovering from 2 surgeries on his legs, Ignatius made a retreat first with the Benedict monks at their abbey in Montserrat in Catalonia in northern Spain, where he hung up his sword before the statue of the Virgin of Montserrat. I should have shown that is depicted in this painting here. The monks introduced him to spiritual exercise of another man named Garcia de Cisneros. From Montserrat, he went to the town of Manresa, where he remained for several months. He spent much of his time praying in a cave nearby, where he practiced rigorous asceticism. During this time, Ignatius experienced a series of visions and formulated the fundamentals of the spiritual exercises. After travels to Rome and an aborted plan to go to the Holy Land, he returned to Barcelona. And in 1524, at the age of 33, he began the next phase of his life that would involve education for the next 11 years, first endeavoring to learn Latin with much younger boys, and culminating with university studies in theology in Paris. And during this period, he refined and eventually completed the spiritual exercises when he was a student in Paris. Now, let me say a little bit now about the spiritual exercises. They're really the foundation of Ignatian spirituality. And the goal of the spiritual exercises is to attain spiritual freedom, clarity, and the capacity to act in accordance with God's will out of love and service. The original formulations were the 30 full days of retreat divided into 4 weeks. But Ignatian, being very forward-looking, had made a 19th annotation in his exercises that called for a retreat in daily life. And I was blessed to do that during my period in Washington, D.C. The discernment of spirits that I spoke about earlier underlies the exercises. It's the ability to where we try to notice the interior movements of our heart, what St. Ignatius called the motions of the soul. These interior movements consisted of thoughts, imaginings, emotions, desires, feelings, repulsions, and attractions to decide where God may be leading us through these movements. Discernment of spirits involves becoming sensitive to these movements, reflecting on them, and understanding where they come from and where they may lead us. Detachment is the freedom to let go, to detach from the outcome, and to trust where God may be leading us. All things in this world are created by God's love. They are presented to us so that we can know God more easily and make a return of God's love. Everything in the world, whether it's my iPhone, my monetary wealth, my job, my friends, my family, is a gift from God to move us closer to his love. As a result, we appreciate and use all these gifts insofar as they help us develop as loving persons. So we're not buying a house for the sake of collecting a possession, but for building a family and community. We're not taking a job for the sake of power, prestige, or money, but for the purpose of helping others and impacting God's world. Related to this is the principle of indifference. And this does not mean not caring. Since God is love and we cannot be indifferent in the Ignatian sense unless we love and we love deeply. Indifference means we want to be free enough, detached from disordered loves or fears, things, people, or experience that prevent us from following God's call. We want to take them up or leave them aside, depending on whether they help me to love God or to love others. And finally, again, I'm mentioning the Examen. The Examen was a component of the exercises that was designed for all the retreatants to continue the practice throughout their lives once they complete the exercises. While in Paris, Ignatius gathered a group of friends and took them through the exercises. And in 1534, these 6 companions plus Ignatius bound themselves together in a communal vows of poverty and chastity. They wanted to put themselves in service to the church and went to Rome to petition to be in new religious orders, the Compagnia de Jesus, the Society of Jesus. But they were not immediately accepted. Ignatius had become viewed by some as a radical. Contemplative's action, that sounded heretical. And religious orders, thought some, should be cloistered. But Ignatius was unwavering and eventually won over some of these critics by articulating his vision for the group and even taking some of his detractors through the exercises. And in 1540, Pope Paul III approved the Society of Jesus. And this one, Ignatius was nearly 50 years old. I'm going to contrast this portrait of Ignatius, and I chose it because it really portrayed him as CEO of the Jesuits. The speculation is that it came from his perceptions of practicality and his austere writing style. And if we contrast it with this, is what I prefer in terms of my vision of Ignatius, of being so open to God's call and feeling the consolation and taking it in. And this is done by Rubens. This one, I think, reflects the perception of even a lot of Jesuits today. And James Martin recounts in one of his books a conversation he had with an elderly Jesuit who had more of a view of Ignatius in this portrait. And his comment was, as he was nearing the end of his life, he says, "I have no problem being judged by Jesus. It's Ignatius that worries me." Ignatius spent the last 16 years of his life in Rome, wrote the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, and organized the Jesuits for global service. In less than a decade, he had 30 Jesuit colleges up and running. In a generation, he had the largest global education network in the world. What really struck me was when we look at our own lives. He was 30 at his transformation, 50 when he founded the Jesuits. So less than half of his life, God made use of it and guided him to do extraordinary things helped him discern God's will, help him become a contemplative action, and really set the world on fire, as he would describe, and has created a spirituality that is guiding millions today. I'm going to pause now before I move on to talk a little bit about some of the components of Ignatian spirituality and see if there are any questions. Okay. I'm going to now talk about three central components that have really touched me. The first is finding God in all things. And you look at this slide, and I must admit, this came as news to me, but there's a thing called Google Images. And by Googling a thing and getting images, I could find all this wonderful art. And I went looking for finding God in all things, and I found all these beautiful portraits of God's creation in nature. And that is a part of finding God in all things. But what really struck me about that is the heart and the center of this. And all of this is ways to find God in all things and bring it into our heart so we can do God's will. Ignatian spirituality is grounded in the conviction that God is active in our world. The spiritual path laid out by Ignatius helps us to turn to God's presence, to find God in all things, in reaching out to a diverse, grace-filled, yet imperfect world, to discover moments in everyday life to encounter God in nature, our relationship, our work, our school, in our own lives, and in those in the lives around us. In our joys, sorrows, successes, failings, triumphs, and tragedies. And it really led me to think about the last year and in what was a tough year for all of us in so many ways, and what it meant to find God in all things during COVID and amid all of the racial injustice that we've seen in our country. For me, it's increased the consciousness of those in need to do something. And I know it's been a wide part of what our community has done as well. It has made me thankful for the way our priests and staff have found ways to connect us with us on so many levels and have us connect with each other. In fact, I've gotten to know so many of you through Zoom calls. In fact, I've joked with Nathan and Ann that I think I've been a virtual parishioner longer than I've been an in-person parishioner. And I think it's also really increased my awareness of nature. And I think some of my friends on this call will note my impromptu text with pictures from Venice Beach of moonrises, which happened for many years. I just happened to notice them during this period. Or one day, just a few months ago, when there was a rainbow over Venice Beach. One of the things for me when I was going through the exercises was finding God in all things, was also recognizing the interconnected of how God works through all areas of our lives. And it came through a period where I really tested the patience of a very patient spiritual director. I went in and was praying, and I would talk to him about my prayer life and my work life. He says, okay, Steve, you don't really have to think about them as separate. Okay, thank you, Kevin. Came back the next week. Well, let me tell you about my prayer life. Let me tell you about my work life. Steve, I thought we talked about this last week. We're supposed to see them as connected. Oh, that's right, Kevin. Thank you. I come in the third week. Let me talk about my work week and my prayer week. And he basically spiritually gave me a kick in the butt and said, have you heard anything I've been saying the last couple of weeks and what I was needed? And that was really a moment that I've looked upon where I really received God's grace to see that, where I looked at my call to seminary and a career in ministry at some point as different from my career as a sustainable investor. And it really helped me and gave me great consolation that as I look back at my life, God had been guiding my love of investing with a passion for creating a more just world. And through doing that, I was able to view my work in sustainable investing as a vocation. And I was touched a few years later when my seminary honored me with with an award for a distinguished alumni in specialized ministry, and it has sustained me to this day. Next point I'd like to talk about is a thing called magis, or the more. And as it says on the screen here, it's a restless desire for greater things. Knowing that there are many possibilities that we seek, and being constantly open to what is more positive, more giving, more of God's will. It's not the best, the most, or the greatest. And as one Jesuit said, who can tell what the best, most, and the greatest things might be for God? What we want to do with the magis is try to do the more, the better, the greater for God, and not for ourselves. And I've included here on this page a quote that I'm not going to read by a man that I had been blessed to become friends with, but was actually my reintroduction to Ignatian spirituality and my interconnectedness with my life in the business world. Chris and I didn't know it, but we were contemporaries growing up in Queens, New York. We went to different Jesuit high schools. Chris entered the Jesuits and was a Jesuit scholastic for almost 6 years before he decided to leave. And he had a very successful career as an investment banker for 17 years. After completing that, he came out and was called to bring his background in Ignatian spirituality to help train leaders. And as you'll see here, he has taken the concept of magis and how it works in terms of people who might be leading organizations and how they might be striving for the more. And the third component of Ignatian spirituality I'm going to talk about this evening is men and women for others. And this bit has been attributed to Pedro Arrupe, who was Superior General of the Jesuits from 1965 to 1983. And he says here, only by being a man or woman for others can one become fully human. He used this first to describe the principal objectives of a Jesuit education: to form men and women for others. Men and women who will not live for themselves, but for God and his Christ. Men and women who cannot even conceive of love of God, which does not include love for the least of their neighbors. Men and women completely convinced that love of God, which does not issue injustice for others, is a farce. So rooted in love for others is service cannot be achieved without genuine love for the people whom we are serving. And today I believe to be men and women for others also means being open to listening and learning from other brothers and sisters who come from different contexts, rooted in race, culture, of religion. And I think the insight that I'm very thankful for was the privilege of being part of our Sacred Space group this year, where we were able to explore in depth and understand through the pain of even people who want to understand how people have suffered from racial injustice. We really have to understand the origins and the context of where that has come from. I'm going to stop here for some questions on those three components before I move on. Okay. Now, let me briefly touch on some recent or contemporary saints. And again, I have saints in quotes, or guides in the wilderness to so many of us. They're examples of men and women for others who strove for the magis and sought to find God in all things. And as I was going through this, again, I initially was going to go through a list of saints. I saw they were chosen by ways that I think they may have been particular about parts of my life that were important, rooted in the justice issues of the 70s and 80s, in Catholic social teachings, and the theology and spirituality that explore boundaries in service of justice, inclusion, and creating a more just world. Starting here with, I think, two men who explored theological boundaries and frontiers with the objective of trying to create frameworks for us to work and challenge ways and thoughts of way things have been done historically to help others. The first person on the bottom is a French Jesuit, he's born in Belgium, Jacques Dupuy. He entered the Jesuits in 1941, and he decided he wanted to be a missionary in India. His 34 years in India informed his work on the relationship between Christianity and other faiths. He was one of the church's leading experts on religious pluralism, what many theologians regard as a key issue in the debate in a globalizing world. His most famous book was a book that I picked up in an independent study that I did while in theology, called Towards a Christian Theology of Religious Pluralism. It really looks at, in God's plans, how other religions mediated salvation for their members. It was hailed as a pioneering work and was praised on the meaning of other religions in God's plan of the salvation of mankind. But it was viewed as controversial by many traditional Catholic theologians. And the Roman Curia charged him with promoting ambiguities in relation to the doctrine of salvation outside the church. It caused him much pain and personal angst in his latter life, as Dupuy was asked to clarify his position, quote, in relation to church teaching. But he was never disciplined. He died just a few years later in 2004. But I think his gift was he set a framework for all people of faith to understand one another and work together as people of God for a better world. The second theologian I have is Ignacio Ellacuria. Ellacuria was born in 1930s in the Spanish Basque Country, and he entered the Jesuits at the age of 17, where he was sent to El Salvador, where he worked for 42 years. He was one of the principal contributors to Latin American liberation theology. Liberation theology emphasizes the imperative of all Christians to aid the poor and the oppressed through involvement in civic and political affairs. So you would think, again, as with Dupuy, this was viewed as revolutionary by both church authorities and as well as secular, and as a threat. He said his historical precedent was the poverty and injustice in El Salvador. Through his theology, he helped to provide a framework to empower the poor of El Salvador to rise up from their poverty. He talked about liberation theology as an opportunity to reflect about faith from the historical present and to reflect about the historical present from faith. Again, contemplative in action, where his life and daily life informed his theology. He and other theologians, liberation theologians, found themselves in conflict with church authorities. Many were censored and with secular powers that put their lives at risk. And in fact, Ignacio was assassinated along with 5 other Jesuits and the 2 women who lived in their community by the El Salvador government forces. Their work, again, I think provided a framework for a lot of people on the front lines of justice. And 2 that I've always admired are Rutilio Grande and Daniel Berrigan. And I'll open Rutilio Grande. In essence, he was the ground force for the frameworks of liberation theology. He was born in 1928 in El Salvador, and he spoke out throughout his life against the injustice at the hands of a very oppressive government, and to get dedicated his life work to organizing the impoverished, marginalized rural farmers of El Salvador. He was responsible, along with many other Jesuits, for establishing Christian-based communities which had their root in liberation theology. The base community, organized through the efforts of priests and lay leaders, helped empower the poor peasants into self-reliant communities. The power here was to flow from the base upward. It was a threat to landowners and the government. And like Ignacio Ellacuria, Rutilio Grande was also assassinated. And as you can see in the portrait of him on the bottom, he is celebrating Mass here with Oscar Romero on the right. And I don't know if anyone has seen, oh, choking me up, the movie Romero, but he was so key in the conversion of Romero, who wasn't sure what to do in the face of the injustice, who in the latter years of his life became the voice for the poor and the powerful, and he too was martyred for the cause of the El Salvadoran people. The second Jesuit I have here is Daniel Berrigan. I was privileged to have met Daniel Berrigan while he was in New York, and I was there on Good Friday in New York. A group called Pax Christi would do a peace walk across 42nd Street, celebrating the Stations of the Cross. And Daniel Berrigan often was on this. He devoted his life to fought for peace, and he is most known as an anti-war activist during the Vietnam War. But he was also very active in the civil rights movement. And he was arrested continuously and spent about 7 years of his life in jail for his beliefs. But a part that is less well known is his work in reaching out to people of other faiths to work together for a more just world. And if you see at the top, this is a picture that I found of him with Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist priest and peace activists. And in 1973, he spent some time in Paris while Thich Nhat Hanh began his exile, and they became a dialogue partner. And they agreed to have these conversations taped. And these conversations eventually became a part of a book called The Raft is Not the Shore, Conversation Toward a Buddhist Christian Awareness. This book, in many ways, looked at them both, and they looked hard. How do we sustain a witness for peace together as people of faith? How do we resist violence without anger and a thirst for power? And how can religious traditions provide answers and explore the reality in many places where religious traditions have in fact been a part of the problem? Now let's move on to two men who have been spiritual guides to me today by the lives they have lived and the way they have advocated for justice. On the bottom right here, I have Father Greg Boyle, who's a Jesuit priest who is a native of Los Angeles and has spent his life there. As a young Jesuit, Boyle spent a year living and working with Christian-based communities in Bolivia, and this informed him. And in 1986, he was appointed the pastor of a church called Dolores Mission Church in the Boyle Heights section of East Los Angeles, which was then the poorest Catholic church in the city and also had the highest concentration of gang activity in the city. Greg, during his ministry, witnessed the devastation of gang violence, culminating where he had 1,000 gang-related killings in his community in 1992. Seeing the futility of law enforcement tactics and criminal justice policies and mass incarceration as a means to end gang violence, he and his parish community adopted what was a radical approach at the time. Let's treat gang members as human beings. He founded Homeboy Industries, and Homeboys offers through today a holistic approach to help gang members become a part of society, offering free services and programs to over 10,000 men and women a year as they look to overcome their past, reimagine their futures, and break the intergeneration cycles of gang violence. He gives them hope. His ministry is recounted in a 2010 New York Times bestseller, Tattoos of the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion. Second Jesuit I've referred to a couple of times, and he's been a guide. I've read everything he's written. His name is Jay Martin. He's a contemporary of mine as well. We're born a few months apart. And I initially found him while I was in searching when I read his first book, while he was still a Jesuit in formation. It was a book called In Good Company. He was a grad of the Wharton Business School, spent the early part of his life working in GE. But I think much like Ignatius found in his earlier life, he found dryness and desolation in that led him to his path to become a Jesuit priest. He has written extensively about Ignatian spirituality, the applications of Ignatian spirituality in different areas of life. But he's also been very key to addressing the justice issues. He has said social justice addresses the things that keep people poor and asks what you should do to these people and discern God's will for all of us to work for them. He has very recently become very involved in the outreach to LGBT Catholics in his book, Building a Bridge, which has caused a lot of controversy and a lot of personal pain by the venom that is thrown his way. But he's been hailed for this. And again, his willingness to bring a spirituality, to see where God was calling him, to applying it to a justice issue has become clear. And again, that has been something that I've really admired him for. Now you notice that we've been talking about men and women for others, but all I've spoken about are men and Jesuits. And they have been incredibly important in spreading Ignatian spirituality. But I have been really moved in my last 10 or 15 years by women who have become Ignatian leaders. And we are blessed to have one of them as one of our priests. Anne has been an Ignatian companion and guide in the wilderness to me. She, along with Nathan and Rob, I think have been guides to all of us in the wilderness of the last year. She is certainly a woman for others, and I think helps us all strive for the Magus and to find God in all things. She and other women have taken up leadership in spiritual direction. And I have also been blessed to encounter, and my current spiritual director is a member of a group called Marisa Way, a group of Catholic women in Portland, Maine, who have become committed to spreading and giving the exercises to many people. I was blessed to have a conversation in the last week with a woman named Ellie Flavin, who has been one of the leaders of Manresa Way, with another woman named Nancy Keller. And she recounted the story to me, how God had guided her in a way to come to Manresa Way. She was initially formed in another group called the Mercy Spirituality Center, run by the Sisters of Mercy in Rochester. And when she and her life moved her to Maine, she came and met with Nancy. And they sat down and she talked about her vision for the exercises and bringing Ignatian spirituality to more people. She said that she and Nancy broke into tears. And Nancy said, "I've been waiting for God to send you to me." And together since 2005, they have formed over 200 spiritual directors to bring the exercises to many people here in New England. Again, I had mentioned they were formed in the Mercy Spirituality Center. The second connection to that is the Sister Mercies have been a part of my life. They educated me in grammar school, and I have been blessed to be a part of the group. I'm on the board that oversees the investments of the sisters, and I've been blessed to see how their spirituality and their discernment informs the way to make them responsible investors. So we've seen guides in the wilderness and how they have answered God's call. And it's overwhelming what they've been able to do, and they are models. But I think, as Anne reminded us in the first week in the quote from Thomas Merton, to be a saint means to be myself. Through discernment and prayer, we can give thanks for the gifts of God and all that God has given each of us, and be open to his individual call for us to use these gifts to make a difference in God's word. Now, before I conclude with an examen prayer, I found the song, and this song gave incredible consolation when I was on a retreat right before I decided to accept the job in Dublin, Ireland in 2008. And it's called Xavier's Song, and it's written by Cristobal Fonas. And it talks about the joy and the consolation of St. Ignatius's journey across the sea to be a ministry in India. And from it, I don't want to compare his journey, knowing he was going there for the rest of the life through seas, to me taking Aer Lingus to Ireland, where I knew I was going to love Dublin life and know I could always find a pint of Guinness. But this was clearly, to me, it encompasses the joy and consolation that comes from Ignatian spirituality and finding God's will. And I'll let Nathan play it for us now.
When the world shuts the sun in darkness, when all dreams are swallowed deep beneath the sea, when no one is so caring to dare cross the ocean that corners the poor and the broken. Rise, my light, my Jesus, set me soaring, flying. Let me trust your promises. Let me do your will. Jesus, fire in my heart aflame in love for the world, feels no limits, sees no boundaries, only God, my hope, feels no limits, sees no boundaries, only God, my hope. Even if I gain the whole world, it's nothing to me if it takes me not to you. May no tides pull me under, no dark walls engulf me in lifting my gaze to your star. There in the eyes of the hungry, I see you looking back to me, and your love fills up my soul. Now my soul sets sail. Jesus, fire in my heart aflame in love for the world, feels no limits, sees no boundaries, only God, my hope, feels no limits, sees no boundaries, only God, my hope. Jesus, you give joy to your people. Jesus, you freedom, giving pardon and your peace. It's such love that impels me, embracing a people that longs for your kingdom to come. All is yours, you've given me. None is mine, but all is grace. In your hands, take all of it. You're my land, my sea. Jesus, fire in my heart aflame in love for the world, feels no limits, sees no boundaries, only God, my hope, feels no limits,
Thank you, Nathan. Okay. Great. Well, now coming down from that song, I think that set my heart on fire. I'd like to just let us slow down, and I'd love to lead you through an examen. This is generally a prayer that I do daily for 15 to 20 minutes. I'll do it abbreviated so we get a feel for it. But it's basically the prayer that Ignatius has given to us to discern how God's movement in our daily lives and where God may be leading us. It generally is broken into 5 parts. The first is we relish what the gifts God has given us. The second, we request God, what we want from God. Third, we review our day. Fourth, we repent. And fifth, we resolve to move forward. What I'd like to do is first just take a minute to center ourselves. This often involves deep breathing. I have often used some practices I've gotten from centering prayer, a mantra for a few minutes. And to be honest, in the last couple of weeks, I've been using the Jesus prayer since our week with Liza. So let's take a minute or so to get centered. Let's ask God to reveal to us all the gifts and graces that have been given to me this day. From the really big ones, my family, my life, safety, love, to the small ones, a good night's sleep, an affirming phone call from a friend, a task completed, a compliment paid to me. For each gift that comes to mind, let's spend a moment giving thanks and praise. knowing that I need God's help to see my darker side realistically, but from the perspective of God's merciful love. I ask God to fill me with his spirit. I ask God to be the leader and initiator of this prayer time, rather than letting me make it in an obsessive brooding over the things I don't like about myself. Let's review the day. Going hour by hour, I review my day in my imagination. I relive each significant moment of my day. I linger at the important moments and I pass quickly through the less relevant ones. Next, let us repent. As I review my day, I continue thanking God for all the gifts that I find in it. But now I pause at any of the difficult moments of the day when I had a bad thought, said something I shouldn't have, or did something inappropriate. I also pay attention to any missed opportunities, such as when I could have acted in a more Christian manner but didn't. When I find moments in which I was not fully the person I'm called to be, I stop and ask forgiveness from God. I try to sense his healing mercy washing over me, making me clean and whole. Finally, I resolve. With what I have learned during this prayer time about myself and my life, I ask God to show me concretely how he wants me to respond or what he wants me to do tomorrow. Perhaps more important, I ask God to show me what kind of a person God is calling me to be tomorrow. I resolve to be that person. I might even make some sort of commitment to that effect. I ask God for help to be the person I am called to be. Let us close by saying the Our Father together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. For thine is the kingdom and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with everyone this evening.
Thank you so much, Steve. I appreciate you guiding us through that and for just sharing your wealth of knowledge on Ignatius with us. So just next week is the last in our series. So Palm Sunday, we'll gather here once again at 5 p.m. And I think originally Anne and I had one vision of what that was going to be. But I think we're kind of veering off course a little bit. And we're going to offer next week as a sort of guide through Holy Week, where Anne and I will offer some brief reflections on each of the days ahead in Holy Week and kind of focus on some of the saints who appear in those familiar Holy Week stories, but maybe may offer a slightly different way to approach the week. So please join us next week. Remember, Compline is at 6:30 this evening.